The village lay in ruins, its buildings reduced to rubble by the relentless bombings. The once bustling streets were now empty, except for the occasional whisper of wind stirring through broken windows. The cold evening air cut through the soldier's uniform, making every step heavier than the last. The distant sounds of gunfire echoed in the mountains, a grim reminder that the war was far from over. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked down the narrow path, eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. Private Daniel Harris had been stationed here for what felt like an eternity. The fatigue weighed on him, but his spirit, unlike some of his comrades, remained unbroken. He wasn't a man of words, but he'd always been the one to offer a kind smile or lend a hand when others needed it. It was that simple compassion that had kept him grounded, despite the chaos and destruction around him. The village had been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. People barely had enough to eat, and many had fled, leaving behind only the broken remnants of their lives. Daniel's heart ached for them, but he kept his focus. His mission was clear, even if the world around him seemed to fall apart. As Daniel continued his patrol, his eyes caught a glimpse of movement near a half-collapsed house on the outskirts of the village. The sight was haunting. Amid the rubble, a small figure sat huddled on the ground, tears streaming down a dirt-streaked face. A boy, no older than 5 or 6, his thin frame barely noticeable under the tattered rags he wore. The soldier's heart sank. The child's cries echoed through the empty street, sharp and full of terror. His small hands clutched his chest, as if trying to hold himself together in the face of overwhelming fear. His clothes were nothing more than scraps of fabric, clinging to his fragile body, barely enough to keep him warm. It was clear he hadn't eaten in days, if not longer. The hollowed look in his eyes mirrored the devastation around him. Daniel's footsteps slowed as he approached, his senses alert, knowing the danger of lingering too long in such a desolate area. But there was something about the child that tugged at his heartstrings. He had seen the horrors of war, but this was something different. The boy was alone. The soldier scanned the area quickly, but no one else seemed to be around. Kneeling down in front of the child, Daniel spoke softly, hoping to calm him. "Hey, little one, are you okay? Where's your family?" But the boy didn't answer. Instead, he just sobbed harder, curling into himself as though the world had shattered around him. Daniel reached into his pack, unsure what to do, but knowing he couldn't leave the child like this. He was all alone. The soldier's heart ached with the thought. Daniel reached into his pack, his fingers brushing against the small tin of food he had saved from the last supply drop. It wasn't much, just some dried rice and a piece of stale bread, but it was warm. He knew the boy must be starving, and for a brief moment, he considered the risk. But he couldn't turn his back. This child had no one else. He sat down in front of the boy, gently offering him the food. "I'm not sure when you last ate, but this will help," he said softly, trying to mask the uncertainty in his voice. The boy's tear-streaked face remained frozen, his small body trembling, too afraid to move. For a moment Daniel thought the child might reject the meal, but hunger, deep, painful hunger, seemed to overpower his fear. The boy's eyes flickered down to the tin, and then back up to the soldier's face. He hesitated, a small whimper escaping his lips, before he slowly reached out with shaking hands and took a bite. Daniel watched the child carefully, feeling a surge of relief as the boy took another bite. His sobs gradually slowed, though the sadness in his eyes never completely faded. The boy ate slowly, almost as if savoring the rare comfort, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. "Where's your family?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice gentle but filled with concern. "Is your mama here, or your papa?" The boy paused, looking down at the food in his hands as if the question had caught him off guard. He didn't answer immediately, just sniffled and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Then, after a long moment, he mumbled something barely audible. "Baba, they took him." Daniel's heart sank at the mention of the word Baba, father in the boy's native tongue. He could tell the child was trying to stay strong, but the vulnerability in his voice betrayed his fear. The soldier's mind raced as he processed the words. Who had taken the boy's father? And why was this child left behind to wander the streets alone? Daniel swallowed hard, pushing aside the unsettling thoughts. The boy was just a child, and right now, he needed safety, he needed protection. As Daniel reached out to comfort the boy, A sharp voice called from behind him. "Private Harris, get away from there. This place isn't safe." Startled, Daniel turned to see one of his comrades, Corporal Jacobs, walking toward him, his rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the surroundings with wary caution. Jacob's face was tense, and his steps were quick, like a man who had seen too much in too little time. "This whole area's been marked as a hot zone," Jacobs continued, his voice urgent. "We've been ordered to move out. It's not worth the risk hanging around here." But Daniel barely heard him. His attention was on the child, who was now trembling more violently than before. The boy's face had gone pale, and his grip on Daniel's arm tightened. He could feel the tiny hands clutching at him, desperate and frantic. Then, without warning, the boy whispered, barely above a breath, "Baba." His voice cracked with fear. "Baba, they're coming for him." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The boy's gaze flickered nervously to the distance, and that's when Daniel heard it, a distant rumble of gunfire. The tension in the air became almost unbearable, the sound echoing through the ruins like a cruel reminder of the violence that still held the land in its grip. Daniel's thoughts went numb for a moment. The boy's whisper, the name Baba, it all hit him like a punch to the gut. The name, it was a name he had heard before, a name that struck fear in every soldier's heart. The name belonged to one of the enemy leaders, a man known for his brutal tactics and ruthless command. The soldier froze, his mind racing. The boy's father, was he really the enemy? How could this child, so innocent, be connected to such a dangerous man? The name echoed in Daniel's mind, sharp and heavy, Baba. For a moment time seemed to stretch as the sound of distant gunfire faded into the background. The boy's trembling fingers, still clutching his arm, were the only thing that anchored Daniel to reality. His heart raced, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The name the child had spoken, Baba, belonged to a man Daniel had feared for months, General Farid al-Majid, a ruthless leader who had terrorized the region for years. The stories of his cruelty were enough to haunt even the bravest soldiers. Al-Majid commanded his forces with iron fists, taking no prisoners, leaving no room for mercy. He was known for his strategic brilliance and terrifying violence, having orchestrated countless massacres during the conflict. Daniel had seen it all firsthand, the massacre in the village of Zafir, where al-Majid's forces had ambushed their unit. The sound of gunfire, the blood-soaked ground, the screams of his fallen comrades, all of it came rushing back. Al-Majid had been there that day, leading the charge, but somehow, despite their best efforts, he had slipped away. Many soldiers had died that day, and Daniel had been one of the lucky ones to make it out alive. But the faces of his fallen comrades haunted him still. Now standing here, looking at this child, who clung to him with desperate trust, Daniel's mind swirled with confusion. The boy's innocent face, streaked with dirt and tears, seemed to contradict everything Daniel knew about his father. Could this child truly be the son of the man who had brought so much suffering to so many? Doubt crept in like a slow poison. Is this child dangerous? Daniel thought. Should I be helping him, or am I just making a mistake? The soldier's chest tightened as the weight of his conflicting thoughts pressed on him. On one hand, this was a child, just a boy, no older than his own younger brother back home. No matter what his father had done, this boy hadn't chosen any of it. He was a victim of this war just as much as the innocent families who had lost everything. But on the other hand, the boy's bloodline was inescapable. The truth was hard to ignore. If this child was truly al-Majid's son, helping him could make Daniel a traitor in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. Would they understand his compassion, or would they see it as an act of betrayal? How many lives had been lost because of al-Majid's orders? How could Daniel reconcile helping his son, the same son of a man who had wiped out entire villages? Looking at the child's trembling form, his wide, pleading eyes, Daniel struggled with his emotions. The boy was just a scared little child. His small, fragile body shook with fear, and his soft whimpers cut through Daniel's hardened heart. The soldier could see it now. The child wasn't the enemy. The boy was a casualty of war, caught in something far bigger than himself. His innocent face, still streaked with tears, was a mirror of all the helpless victims caught in this endless cycle of violence. What had al-Majid's war taken from him too? Daniel thought, his heart aching as he looked into the boy's eyes. He couldn't just turn away. He couldn't leave this child to suffer, no matter who his father was. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself, and gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy flinched, but didn't pull away. With a quiet, determined resolve, Daniel made a decision. He would protect the child, if only for the sake of the innocence that war had tried so hard to steal away. As Daniel made the decision to protect the boy, a voice broke through the silence, sharp and filled with urgency. "Private Harris, what the hell are you doing?" Jacobs barked, stepping closer with an angry frown. The other soldiers were beginning to gather around, their eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "That kid, he's the enemy's blood. We can't afford to be soft, not now, not here." Daniel stood firm, his hand still on the boy's shoulder. He could feel the child's trembling under his touch, and it only strengthened his resolve. The boy wasn't the enemy, he was a child, just a boy who had lost everything, caught in the crossfire of a war that didn't care about innocence. "I'm not leaving him," Daniel said quietly, his voice unwavering despite the tension rising around him. "He's not the enemy, he's just a kid who needs help." The other soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, but the pressure mounted. Jacob stepped forward, his face hardening with frustration. "This is a war, Harris. The enemy doesn't care about who you help. They won't hesitate to use him against you. You're risking the lives of all of us. You know what kind of man his father is." "I'm not letting him go," Daniel insisted, his voice firm but filled with the weight of his choice. "I can't." His heart ached as the boy looked up at him, with those wide, pleading eyes, silent tears still streaking down his cheeks. The soldiers muttered among themselves, but none of them said anything else. Daniel could feel the tension, the mistrust. In their eyes he was making a mistake, but to him leaving the boy behind would be a far greater one. As they prepared to move out, a small voice cut through the air. The boy's hand, still gripping Daniel's arm, suddenly pointed toward the distant ruins, where a collapsed building loomed. His eyes were wide with fear and hope, as if his entire being was focused on that one spot. "Papa," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible, as he pointed toward the wreckage. "Baba, he might be there." Daniel's chest tightened. The boy was leading him to his father, the man he had feared for so long. There was no telling what dangers lay ahead, but the soldier couldn't ignore the child's plea. The boy was searching for his father, and despite everything, despite the risks, Daniel couldn't abandon him now. With a deep breath, Daniel nodded. "We're going. Stay close," he murmured, to the boy, and without another word, he started walking toward the ruins. His comrades hesitated for a moment, then followed reluctantly, knowing that once the decision was made, they had no choice but to follow through. The journey to the ruins was tense. Daniel led the way, his every step measured, his rifle at the ready. The other soldiers trailed behind, still uneasy, their eyes darting to the shadows, but it wasn't the enemy that Daniel feared. It was the child, clinging to his side, his fragile trust resting in Daniel's hands. The boy didn't say anything else, but his eyes were glued to the crumbled building ahead, hope and desperation fighting for dominance in his gaze. They reached the remains of what had once been a small house, now little more than broken walls and twisted metal. The boy pointed toward a collapsed doorway, his small hand shaking. "Papa," he whispered again. Daniel motioned for his comrades to stay back. As he moved carefully inside, the dim light revealed a hidden shelter beneath the debris. His eyes adjusted, and in the far corner, barely illuminated by the faint light filtering through the cracks, was a figure barely clinging to life. Daniel's heart stopped. The man lying on the ground, bleeding from several wounds, was none other than General Farid al-Majid, the ruthless leader who had caused so much suffering. His once imposing figure was now a broken shell, his clothes soaked in blood, his breathing shallow. The boy ran to his side, calling out in a voice filled with both fear and hope. "Baba, Baba." Al-Majid's eyes flickered open, his face twisted in pain, but when he saw his son, something inside him seemed to soften. Despite the blood, despite the injuries, the coldness of war, his expression softened. There was love, tenderness, beneath the hardened exterior. His hand reached out weakly toward his son, and when the boy hesitantly took it, Al-Majid managed a faint smile. The soldier froze, his heart clenched. The enemy, this man who had caused so much devastation, was not just a monster of war, he was a father, a human being. And the boy standing there beside him was not just the enemy's child, he was the child of a man who loved him, who would have done anything to protect him. In that moment, Daniel's mind reeled. War had turned men into enemies, had twisted them into something unrecognizable. But in the eyes of this father and son, the soldier saw something undeniable: humanity. The love of a father for his child was universal, regardless of the uniform they wore, the side they fought for. Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened. He had seen this kind of love in his own family, in his own parents, and now he saw it here, in the most unlikely of places. The soldier's mind was torn between duty and compassion, between the man who had killed so many and the father who was fighting, in his own way, to stay alive for his son. For a long moment, Daniel stood in silence, watching the fragile bond between father and child. The war, with all its cruelty and destruction, suddenly seemed so much smaller in the face of that simple universal truth. Daniel stood frozen, his rifle still in his hand, but his mind was far from the battlefield. The decision loomed over him, heavy and suffocating: leave them here, to the mercy of fate, or risk everything to help them escape. The soldier could already hear the voice of command in his mind, reminding him of the orders: leave no one behind, especially not an enemy leader. But as he looked at the wounded man, a father who was just as human as any of them, and at the child who had trusted him, his heart ached with a choice he couldn't ignore. Against his orders, Daniel turned. He placed the remaining supplies in a corner of the shelter, leaving enough food and water to sustain them. The boy and his father needed more than just his sympathy, they needed a chance to survive. The weight of the decision sat heavy on his chest, but in that moment he knew it was the right thing to do. As Daniel walked toward the entrance, the boy suddenly broke free from his father's side and ran after him. He threw his arms around Daniel's legs, his tiny body shaking with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Thank you, Baba," he whispered, his voice full of innocence. The soldier's heart shattered. He looked back one last time as the boy and his father disappeared into the ruins. He felt both sorrow and a fragile hope that even in the darkest corners of war, there was still light to be found. Thank you for joining us in this emotional and unforgettable story. In a world torn apart by war, it's easy to forget the humanity behind the uniforms, the faces behind the enemies. But as we saw today, love and compassion can still shine through, even in the darkest moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who might need a reminder that hope can still be found, no matter the odds. And if you want more heartwarming stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.